Politics continue to keep people here in Korea poles apart, divided between generations and even genders. This phenomenon, however, appears more or less universal. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Friday, January 24th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we address the impact of political polarization on the stability of our societies and more. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, it's great to have you back this week.
Happy to be back with you, as always.
I also have Colin Marshall with the Foreign Pundit's take on the issues at hand. Colin, as always, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sunny.
Right, Kelly, there are grave concerns about the deepening political divide here in Korea. Based as a journalist in this country, what is your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always concerned about the divide and the polarization in Korean politics. To be honest with you, as someone who's been reporting here 8 years, I don't know if it's so much that in this moment in time things are more divided, as opposed to the fact that we're really seeing a spotlight on how polarized things are because of everything that's going on with President Yoon after the declaration of martial law. I think we're kind of working in this reality now where we're no longer debating how to fix something, but rather we're debating what reality is, and this has been a phenomenon that's been going on for years. In the early days of YouTube and social media driving conspiracy theories, we used to laugh because the conspiracy theories that were being touted on the internet were more along the lines of, is Michael Jackson really dead or not, right? But now we're dealing with conspiracy theories on the right-wing Korean YouTube channels that are about whether or not the Korean Parliament or the National Assembly is legitimate because there are accusations that the general elections were rigged, which has not been supported by any sort of independent investigation. And so anyway, all of this is to say, I mean, the polarization and the division is bad enough that it was able to delay the arrest of the president, right? Because there were thousands of people showing up trying to block the police and investigators from detaining him originally. But with that said, I mean, the majority of Koreans, according to polls, still do not believe that the declaration of martial law was fair or right and want to see some kind of consequence or legal process play out. So it's concerning, but I hope that's a little optimistic or reassuring to people listening that I still think there's some general consensus here.
Right. Colin, what do you suppose is further aggravating Korea's political polarization this time around?
Well, when I think of political polarization in Korea, the first thing that always comes to mind to clarify is that from an American perspective, South Korea doesn't look all that polarized in the sense that the political parties are not separated by much ideologically. Right and left are not as distinct to an American in any case as they would be in their own country. And what are the major issues here that divide right from left? Well, there's North Korea and North Korea. I mean, it comes down to one or two major issues, and there aren't that many more wedges ideologically between the parties. And so, well, okay, in one sense, maybe South Korea is not divided in the way the U.S. is. The U.S. is famous for political division. The pundit Ezra Klein, or commentator, I'll say, Ezra Klein, wrote a whole book called Why We're Polarized a few years ago. So you can't really talk about politics in the U.S. without polarization coming up. In South Korea, the polarization seems to be on a more personal level. You hear about sort of families getting into debates or worse. You hear about men and women being on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But a lot of this, I suspect, has to do, you asked why this is all aggravated. It's aggravated to my mind primarily by the fact that, how to put it, there are not major differences in the American sense. Koreans seem to agree, politicians or otherwise, generally how government money should be spent. Generally, on social issues that are very divisive in the US, there's pretty broad agreement here. Again, by comparison. So when you have this base of similarity, you do get what's often called the narcissism of minor differences. Smaller differences become blown up, they turn into more of a tinderbox themselves. And so I think context is very important here. Because the context has so much consensus by comparison to certain other countries, the issues that do become controversial feel more bitterly divisive.
Right. Kelly, some pro-Yoon supporters claim to see hope in Mr. Trump's return to the White House. And promptly after returning to the White House, President Trump moved to pardon January 6 rioters who stormed the Capitol back in 2021. I asked the same question actually to Thomas Maresca during our talk yesterday. Thomas Maresca, of course, the correspondent of UPI. What has been the response, in your view, to Mr. Trump's pardoning of these rioters?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fairly divisive issue, just because the U.S. itself is so divided. And as Colin mentioned, you know, in a way that is a bit more extreme, perhaps, in the United States. I mean, Nancy Pelosi called this like an injustice to our democratic system. I mean, that tends to be the view of many people on the left, or even more in the moderate center. I mean, you have a situation where there were people basically not respecting the results of the election, who had no real evidence of any election meddling happening, who then stormed the Capitol. Some of these people assaulted police officers, you know, threatening, in essence, violence against people within the Capitol. So really threatening the democratic process. And the lesson that's being kind of touted now is that that's okay as long as the person that you were supporting ultimately gets power and pardons you. So I think there's a legitimate concern there. But back to our talk earlier about conspiracy theories and polarization, if you're someone who really believes in alternative facts, where you think that you defended democracy that day, that you defended a fair and rightful election, you know, this is obviously a victory to you, right? Because these people have been wrongfully jailed or wrongfully sentenced, and now they're free to walk. So I think it really depends on who you're asking. At the same time, I think across the board, there are some broader implications as well. Not only did Trump pardon about 1,500 people who had, you know, varied levels of severity in terms of what they've been charged and convicted with, but he also commuted the sentences of multiple people in the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, who are seen as kind of far-right militant groups. Some countries even see them as terror groups. Some members of these groups have been linked to white supremacist ideas. And so, you know, it's controversial, but I would think that generally speaking, it's a move that is being condemned broadly on the global stage, at least.
Right. Colin, back here in South Korea, dozens were arrested after the storming of the Seoul Western District Court in the early hours of Sunday, following the court's decision to formally extend President Yoon Suk-yeol's detainment. Now, among those arrested, about half were young men in their 20s and 30s. What are your thoughts regarding this phenomenon?
Well, first, I think there's a bit of a selection effect here, because we're talking about storming a building. And if the action is storming a building, it's not going to be elderly women, you find, in this group, right? Same with the January 6th events. You know, these were not, this is going to be a certain demographic because that's the one who's going to do this sort of thing. But I think the temptation here, from a certain political perspective, would be to connect this storming of the court with the idea of Yoon Suk-yeol having been elected in what was called in South Korea's incel election. I think I heard incel meaning involuntarily celibate. The idea being, oh, there's men, young or youngish men, a lot of them who can't find a wife or a girlfriend, and this resentment pushed them to support what the Western media sees as a far right-wing candidate in Yoon Suk-yeol. I'm not sure ideologically how right-wing he is if you really line him up with sort of the whole global spectrum. But in any case, that this is tempting. It's tempting as a commentator to tie these two things together, these two phenomena together. But, you know, part of me wonders, are there really enough, shall we say, incels to swing an election in South Korea in the first place? But even if we say there are, the attitude toward that tends to be to dismiss what underlying conditions may have caused it. It's like if your roof is leaking, you could look at the leak in the roof and say, that leaking roof, like, ugh, it's the 21st century. What do you mean the roof is leaking? It's not going to solve the problem. Your roof is leaking. Like, society has some condition, even if you disagree with these guys in every respect, which makes sense to do, there's something that needs to be fixed, something to do with young people not feeling like they have opportunities in South Korea to build a middle-class life. Men or women. Women feel it differently. but I think they still feel it here. And that question of what's getting in the way of starting a life here, of getting sort of onto the middle class ladder, not just finding a man or a woman or whatever it might be, but this whole why don't younger generations feel like they can even get on that ladder? There's something we have to address, and it gets us attention because it's less attention grabbing than a bunch of 20, 30-year-old men storming a court or a capitol. But I think that would be a bit more worrisome in the long run.
Right. Meanwhile, Kelly, there seems to be a growing political divide between Gen Z men and women with regard to politics, that is, of course, beyond Korea's borders as well. I mean, there have been reports about the growing political gap between the two since 2-3 years ago. What are your thoughts regarding this?
Yeah, I'm not sure which one came first, if it started in South Korea or in the United States, but I think the discussion on a national level in the United States about the polarization between young men and young women has been going on maybe a bit longer on a larger scale. It's absolutely true that this has been an increasing issue in South Korea in the last couple of years. In the US, I would say it's been going back at least 10 years, if not more. But what we're basically seeing, and this is according to several studies and recent polls, but on average, Gen Z women are more likely to identify as liberal. A recent poll suggested that Gen Z women, about 40% of them would say that they're liberal compared to 25% of men. Gen Z women tend to be nowadays more educated. They pursue higher education at a higher rate than young men. When you pursue a higher education in the United States, you tend to come out being a bit more on the left. And also, women's status, you could argue, has generally increased in society. Women are more independent. They need men less to have, good income, good career, good social standing, whereas men's status overall has stayed fairly stagnant, or in some men's view, has decreased if you look at it from being in competition with women, right? And so there are a lot of parallels going on there between South Korea and the United States. Some pundits have even gone as far to declare it a culture war between genders. I don't really know if that is the case. Honestly, I don't study this every day, but certainly those parallels exist, and they're enough to maybe by a razor-thin margins sway the vote. We saw in President Yoon's election, it wasn't that young male voters won him the election, but they were a key swing group that helped him out in the end. And, in the United States, this election was actually very close in terms of the popular vote. And we did see that, trust me, a lot of women also voted for Trump, but certainly there was a big discrepancy between young women and young men. More young men were likely to support Trump.
Right, and keeping in mind this political divide between the genders, Colin, a local survey here in the country shows that most Koreans believe the government holds the responsibility to bridge this gap, but very few Koreans believe the government has the ability to do so. What is your interpretation of this finding? Yeah,
I do wonder how much sway over the hearts and minds of Koreans the government actually has. It brings to mind an old Korean joke that I quote very often, which is about what a woman does, women of various nationalities do when they find out their husband is cheating on them. The Russian woman shoots her husband. The American woman sues her husband. That's very astute, I think. The Korean woman blames the government. And this is a joke about the relationship of Koreans to their government and how, I'll put it this way, Brian Myers, who is a North Korea analyst based in Busan, he wrote a book in Korean last year called 사랑받지 못하는 공화국, or The Unloved Republic. And it's all about how the Republic of Korea, per se, has never received really any love from South Koreans. It is an unloved republic, literally. It's confusing for a foreigner or a Westerner to hear this sometimes, because they think of Koreans, they think, oh, Koreans are patriotic, Koreans are nationalistic, Koreans must love their country, they've always got the flag, But it's not quite US-style patriotism here. It's more of a nationalism oriented around the Korean people. The Taegukgi, in Brian Myers' view and the view of others, is the flag of a people, more so than of a state. And so you have this relationship fairly unhealthy with the government here, where it's like, okay, the Korean people do all the good, the government does all the bad. So if that's your view, it's going to be hard to expect the government to heal a rift among the people. But I think this goes hand in hand. You sort of hate the government, but also you expect you expect it to fix everything. And this syndrome is not unknown in the US, but here it's especially pronounced. So I wouldn't say that I don't think this division can ever be lessened or can ever be fixed, but I don't think it'll be by the state.
Right, that's something to think about, though. It's quite sad if you think of it that way. So we love the country itself, but the government we're a bit dissatisfied with. Kelly, on some lighter stories then. So starting this weekend, Korea starts to celebrate its extended Lunar New Year holiday, and quite a number of people are thinking about traveling overseas. The Korean passport for the year 2025 has been found to be the third most powerful, with visa-free access to, I believe, 192 destinations. Could you tell us a bit about the Henley Index for passports and what it means?
Yeah, the Henley Index is an index that's put out, I think, annually by this consultancy firm. You know, a lot of consultancy firms will do research and put out indexes or reports, in part because it pays them back by getting some press attention, but also they take a look at things that are of interest to the average person or the average consumer. As an American passport holder and as a mixed race, you know, American and Korean, I think I've taken for granted how powerful my passport is, and I think certainly many South Koreans who are of the younger generation have as well. This index basically ranks passports based on how many countries they can travel to visa-free. As you mentioned, South Korea is tied for third place with Finland, France, Italy, Germany, and I think a couple of other countries. Singapore's number 1. Japan's number 2. That was a little surprising to me. And the US is actually ranked number 9, which people always talk about how strong the US passport is. So that was a little surprising for me. Another interesting take on this was that China has risen significantly, I think by more than 20 rankings since they last did this report. You know, I don't know what kind of diplomacy is going on for China to increase the number of countries it can travel to visa-free, but certainly that looks like there's maybe some kind of investment from the Chinese government to better the strength of its passport and the travel ability of its citizens. And yeah, on a fun note, it means you can go to a lot of different countries. On a geopolitical note, it's also interesting because, I mean, this stuff really matters for people who have passports that are weaker. It really limits their opportunities, not just for travel, but for studying, for mobility, life opportunities. So, you know, Koreans should go to all 192 countries if they can in the 10 days they get off.
Right. I believe Singapore, number 1, can go into 195 countries visa-free then.
Wow, the extra 3, yeah, gets you to number 1.
Okay. Colin, this is an impromptu question, talking about travel. The government here has been talking about the importance of seeking to travel within national borders as well, given the state of the economy. What would be your recommendation for a place to travel here within Korean borders for a foreign visitor?
For a foreign visitor, it's a good question. And I've talked to foreigners who are so much more well-traveled than I am in Korea that I feel like, oh, should I think about their recommendations or should I think about my own? But, you know, I like to go to places that usually foreigners don't get to. For example, Mokpo I enjoyed going to a few years ago, but then it turns out, you know, I was talking to an Italian lady a few months ago who was obsessed with Mokpo, and she lives outside of Korea right now, but is just doing her all to get a visa to come retire to Mokpo. So it's like, well, I guess that's not a unique recommendation anymore. But I think, you know, if you go to any place you've never heard of before, you have a good chance of discovering, shall we say, the real Korea. I think a lot of foreigners here, especially Westerners who visit, they have this idea, I want to see the real Korea, I want to see the authentic Korea, I don't want to see just Seoul. But if you leave Seoul, the divide is so stark between Seoul and everywhere else, well, you're in it then, and you do experience certain good things, certain things that have disappeared from Seoul, and you get to experience as well, you see with your own eyes, the birth rate really has caused the average age to rise markedly when you leave Seoul. So it's good to get out of Seoul, not just for seeing different regions, hearing different accents, tasting different foods, but also seeing these phenomena you read about in the news. You don't necessarily see them in Seoul. In Seoul, the birth rate problem is not evident as much as it is in any other part of the country. So be prepared to see everything. Keep your eyes open. Don't just look for the good stuff, I would say. Look for the whole spectrum of sort of desirable to undesirable, because it's all there.
Right. And that being said, Kelly, where would you like to recommend, if you're recommending a place to visit around Korea for a foreign visitor who's been here for the first time, what place or venue would you choose?
I really like Ganghwa-do. I actually went there a couple of times in my 8 years here as a reporter because, I mean, it's near the border with North Korea, right? But I went recently with my Korean family just for a vacation, and I saw a completely different side to it. I enjoyed the Sijang, the local markets there. They're very different from the ones in Seoul. I enjoyed the nature. You could get like a nice pension out there. My dog was running free. It was just kind of like a nice place to really take in that Korean worship of nature, which you kind of lose sight of when you're in Seoul. It's close enough, so it's not too far for a foreign visitor. It's accessible. I mean, you need a car, but you can also figure it out with a bus and a taxi. So I would say that that's an easy one that's maybe not too overwhelming. And if you're a little bit of a dark tourist and you want to, use the telescopes to go see a North Korean village, you can also do that. So you can get, your sociological viewing of the inter-Korean issue as well.
Right. For those who don't have any plans this Lunar New Year holiday, that might be one option. All right, Kelly, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Colin, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this week's editions of Press Perspective. We are looking ahead to an extended Lunar New Year holiday here in Korea, so we'll be back at the same time next Friday. Happy Seollal.